The courtroom was completely silent. Not the normal quiet of people waiting their turn, but the heavy, uncomfortable kind of silence where no one moves, no one breathes too loudly, and every eye is locked on a single man standing alone at the defense table. Even seasoned court staff felt it. This wasn't just another dispute between neighbors. This was something darker. Something personal. A neighbor. A family. And a comment so hateful that when it was spoken the entire room froze, not in confusion but in disbelief. No shouting. No chaos. Just a moment where everyone realized they were about to witness a line being crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. What made this case different wasn't just what was said, but who heard it, who it was said in front of, and what it revealed about a mindset that still exists in places people like to call quiet American neighborhoods. As the judge reviewed the file in front of him, it became clear this wasn't a misunderstanding or a heated moment taken out of context. It was a pattern. And what happened next didn't just decide the fate of one man standing in that courtroom, it exposed a truth America is still wrestling with, whether it wants to admit it or not. If you believe respect should never depend on skin color, you'll want to stay with this case, because moments like this are exactly why people find themselves hitting like before the verdict even comes down. They were the kind of family most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking closely. Working class, routine-driven, quietly consistent. The parents both worked full-time, early mornings, long commutes, tired evenings, but they never missed the small things that mattered. Dinner together whenever possible. Homework checked at the kitchen table. Shoes lined neatly by the door. They paid their taxes, followed the rules, waved to neighbors, and kept their heads down in the way millions of American families learn to do without ever being formally taught. They had lived in the neighborhood for years. Long enough for the cracks in the sidewalks to feel familiar. Long enough to know which lawns were watered too often and which houses still had holiday lights up months late. Long enough to believe, perhaps naively, that they belonged there just as much as anyone else. Their house wasn't the biggest or the newest, but it was theirs. Purchased with savings, repaired with weekends, and filled with the ordinary chaos of family life. Weekends were sacred. Saturdays meant grocery runs in the morning and the smell of food drifting through the backyard by late afternoon. The grill came out as soon as the weather allowed. Not for parties or noise, just for family. Burgers, chicken, the occasional ribs when overtime pay allowed it. Laughter mixed with the crackle of fire. Music played low enough that the kids could still hear each other argue over whose turn it was to ride the bike or kick the ball. Their children were the kind of kids neighbors usually smiled at. Bikes leaning against mailboxes. Chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Scuffed sneakers from playing too hard and caring too little. The parents watched from a distance, not hovering but present. Protective in the quiet way. The kind of vigilance that doesn't come from fear alone, but from experience. Because while this family loved their neighborhood, they also understood something about the country they lived in. The parents had learned it early, passed down through conversations that were never dramatic but always serious. Talks that happened late at night when the kids were supposed to be asleep. Or in the car when the radio was off and the road stretched quiet ahead. Be polite, they told their children. Don't argue with adults. Keep your hands visible. If someone is angry, don't escalate. And most importantly, spoken gently, never angrily, sometimes it's safer to keep your head down. They didn't say it because they wanted their children to feel small. They said it because they wanted them to be safe. Because they knew that for families like theirs, mistakes weren't always forgiven equally. That misunderstandings didn't always stay misunderstandings. That being right didn't always mean being protected. Still, they tried to give their kids a normal childhood. As normal as any American family could manage. Birthday candles. School pictures stuck to the fridge. Weekend chores followed by movie nights. They believed that if they did everything right, worked hard, respected others, followed the rules, that would be enough. For a long time it seemed like it was. They didn't cause trouble. They didn't complain. When someone parked too close to their driveway, they shrugged it off. When comments were made that felt a little sharp, a little unnecessary, they chose silence over conflict. They believed peace was built by endurance, by patience, by not giving anyone a reason to point fingers. What they didn't realize, what no one ever really realizes until it's too late, was that someone nearby had been watching them all along. Not casually, not indifferently, watching with judgment. From behind curtains. From the edge of driveways. From the place where resentment quietly grows when it isn't challenged. Every barbecue, every laugh, every moment of comfort they allowed themselves was noticed, interpreted, twisted. To one neighbor their normalcy wasn't invisible, it was offensive. The family had sensed something was off but never enough to name it. A look held a second too long. A complaint that felt exaggerated. The way greetings weren't returned. The way smiles disappeared when the kids rode past. Small things. Easy to dismiss. Easier to ignore. They told themselves it was nothing. That they were imagining it. That not everyone had to like everyone else. They chose peace again and again, because peace felt safer than confrontation. Because they believed that if they stayed respectful, stayed quiet, stayed within the lines would protect them too. They didn't know that resentment doesn't fade when it's ignored. It sharpens. They didn't know that someone had already decided they didn't belong. Not because of noise. Not because of behavior. But because of who they were. Because of how they looked. Because of something they could never change no matter how polite, quiet, or law-abiding they tried to be. And they certainly didn't know that all of this, the years of watching, the silent judgments, the growing anger, was about to spill out in a single moment that their children would hear, remember, and never fully forget. Stories like this matter because they don't happen in distant places or dramatic headlines. They happen in real neighborhoods, on real streets, to families who believe they were safe. And supporting this channel helps keep these moments visible, especially when silence would be easier. The neighbor had lived on that street for a long time, long enough to believe tenure gave him ownership over more than just his own property. He spoke loudly, moved confidently, and carried himself with the kind of certainty that comes from never being challenged in spaces he considers his own. To him, the neighborhood wasn't just a place to live. It was a hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, he believed he stood above others simply because he had arrived first. He made sure people knew it too. He talked about how the neighborhood used to be, how things were better back then, how he remembered when every house looked a certain way and every family looked a certain way too. He wasn't subtle about it. He didn't need to be. He assumed agreement. And when he didn't get it, he grew louder instead. At first, his behavior registered as irritation more than threat. He complained about noise that no one else noticed. Filed reports about parking that technically followed the rules. Left notes, always firm, always accusatory, on windshields and doors. Most neighbors shrugged him off as, that guy, the one who called city offices for sport and treated minor inconveniences like personal attacks. But his attention was not evenly distributed. While others brushed off his outbursts, one family began to notice a pattern. His gaze lingered longer when he passed their house. His complaints always seemed to trace back to their address. When kids played on the sidewalk in front of other homes, he said nothing. When those same kids rode their bikes past his driveway, he stood at the edge of his lawn and stared, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes sharp. He watched. Constantly. Sometimes it was obvious, standing near his mailbox, pretending to check his phone. Other times it was subtle, a face half visible through a window, curtains barely parted. The family felt it before they could articulate it. That quiet sense of being observed. Measured. Judged. Then the comments started. Not overt. Not yet. They came wrapped in plausible deniability. Phrases that could be laughed off if challenged. Words that sounded harmless unless you knew what they were really saying. People like you don't usually stay long around here. This neighborhood has standards. Some families don't understand how things work. Each time the family chose restraint. They responded politely or not at all. They didn't want trouble. Didn't want to confirm any stereotype he might already be clinging to. They believed that calm would diffuse whatever tension was building. But calm didn't satisfy him. Because what bothered him wasn't behavior, it was presence. He complained about trash cans left out too long, even when city guidelines were followed. He claimed their barbecue smoke was excessive, despite it lasting no longer than anyone else's weekend cookouts. He called the homeowners association over decorations that violated no rule. Each complaint was small enough to seem petty, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. It was always them. Never the louder houses. Never the parties down the street. Never the neighbors whose dogs barked late into the night. Only this family. Only their children. Only their home. The family noticed it. So did others. But no one intervened. Because confronting someone like him meant escalation. And escalation meant unpredictability. What made it worse was the way he framed himself as the victim. To anyone who would listen, he claimed he was simply protecting the neighborhood. That he was the last line of defense against decline. That if he didn't speak up, no one would. In his mind, he wasn't harassing a family. He was preserving order. And when he talked about the family, his language sharpened. They don't respect the neighborhood. They bring their habits here. They should know better. Each sentence carried the same implication. They were outsiders. Temporary. Unwelcome. No matter how long they lived there, how much they worked, how carefully they followed the rules, they would never be considered equal in his eyes. He began calling authorities more frequently. Non-emergency lines. City offices. Noise complaints logged within minutes of the grill being lit. Each call escalated his sense of power. Each time nothing happened, his frustration grew. Because he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. He wanted submission. Apology. Retreat. Instead, the family kept living their lives. That infuriated him. To him, their calm wasn't grace, it was defiance. Their laughter felt provocative. Their normalcy felt like an insult. And the fact that they refused to react only convinced him that stronger action was necessary. He started speaking louder, standing closer, letting his voice carry so others could hear. He wanted witnesses, wanted validation, wanted someone, anyone, to confirm that he was right to feel threatened by people who looked different but acted no differently than anyone else. And slowly, almost inevitably, the restraint he had maintained slipped. The comments became less coded, less deniable. People like you don't belong here. I've lived here longer than you ever will. This isn't the kind of neighborhood for families like yours. Each remark landed heavier than the last. And with every one, the tension thickened. Neighbors felt it. The family felt it most of all. They began adjusting their routines, shortening outdoor time, calling the kids inside earlier. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because peace felt fragile, and they were trying desperately not to be the ones blamed if it shattered. But resentment doesn't care about caution. It builds. It festers. And eventually it demands release. By the time the confrontation finally came, it didn't feel sudden. It felt overdue. Like a storm everyone sensed was coming but hoped would pass them by. And when it did come, it came loudly, publicly, and with words that could never be taken back. The kind of words that would end any pretense of misunderstanding, and force everyone, including a courtroom full of strangers, to confront exactly what had been growing behind that neighbor's stare all along. It happened on a quiet weekend afternoon, the kind Americans associate with rest, family, and a temporary pause from the pressures of the week. The sun sat comfortably overhead, not harsh, not hidden. The street was calm. Lawns trimmed. Driveways empty. The family had done nothing different from what they'd done dozens of times before. A small grill was set up in the backyard, smoke rising lightly into the air, carrying the familiar smell of food cooking, comforting, ordinary, unmistakably domestic. The kids were outside too. Not running wild, not screaming. Just being kids. One rode a bike in slow circles near the sidewalk. Another bounced a ball against the fence, counting quietly under their breath. Their laughter was soft, intermittent, the kind neighbors usually smile at without thinking twice. From the patio, the parents watched with relaxed attention. Present, protective, but finally allowing themselves a moment to breathe. That moment didn't last. The first sign was a voice. Loud. Sharp. Cutting through the calm like something thrown. Hey. Not a greeting. A summons. The family froze for half a second, exchanging a glance that carried more meaning than words. They knew that voice. They had heard it before, complaining, muttering, hovering at the edge of conversations. But never like this. Never directed straight at them. Never this public. The neighbor stood at the edge of his driveway, arms stiff at his sides, face tight with something far beyond irritation. He didn't walk over calmly. He marched. Each step deliberate. Each footfall heavy with intent. Other neighbors glanced out of windows, sensing tension without yet understanding it. Do you have to do this every weekend? He snapped, loud enough for the children to hear. One of the parents stepped forward immediately, instinctively positioning themselves between him and the kids. Calm voice. Neutral tone. The same approach they'd always used. We're not being loud, they said. We're just cooking. That should have been the end of it. It would have been, for almost anyone else. But the neighbor wasn't interested in resolution. He was interested in dominance. I don't care what you call it, he shot back. This isn't the kind of thing we want around here. The words hung in the air, vague but heavy. One child slowed their bike, sensing the shift. Another stopped bouncing the ball. The parents tried again. De-escalation. Always de-escalation. If there's a problem, we can talk about it, one of them said. There's no need to raise your voice. That was when his restraint, thin to begin with, collapsed entirely. He laughed. Not nervously. Not awkwardly. A sharp, dismissive sound that carried contempt. You people always say that, he said. The sentence landed hard. The parents stiffened. They had heard versions of it before, but never this plainly. Never this unguarded. And never with their children standing close enough to hear every syllable. What does that mean? One parent asked, still calm, still measured, though something fragile had cracked beneath the surface. The neighbor didn't hesitate. Didn't soften. Didn't back down. It means this neighborhood wasn't built for people who look like you, he said, his voice rising. I don't want to see your skin color plastered all over my street like it belongs here. Time seemed to stall. The kids heard it. All of it. One froze mid-step. Another looked up, eyes wide, confusion giving way to something far heavier. The youngest tugged on a parent's sleeve, not understanding the words but understanding the tone, the hostility, the rejection, the sudden danger in the air. The parents reacted instantly. That's enough, one of them said, voice firm now. Not loud. Firm. You need to stop. But he didn't. He took a step closer, emboldened by the silence around him. By the fact that no one had stopped him yet. This is my neighborhood, he said. I've lived here longer than you ever will. You don't belong here, and your kids need to learn that before someone else teaches them the hard way. The words were no longer coded. No longer ambiguous. They were naked in their intent. And they cut deep. One parent raised their hands slightly, not in surrender but in a plea for calm. Our children are here, they said. Please. There's no reason for this. That was the moment many viewers would recognize instantly. The moment when dignity is tested. When restraint is chosen not because it's easy, but because the alternative feels too dangerous to risk. The family didn't shout back. They didn't insult him. They didn't mirror his rage. They did what they had always done. They tried to end it peacefully. But peace was no longer what he wanted. You know what? He snapped. I'm done talking. I'm calling the police. One of the kids flinched at the word. The neighbor pulled out his phone with exaggerated confidence, tapping the screen as if performing for an audience. His voice was loud enough to carry across lawns now. There's a disturbance, he said into the phone. A family that doesn't belong here is causing problems again. Again. That single word told the whole story. The parents stood still, hearts pounding, minds racing. They knew what this could turn into. They knew how quickly situations like this could spiral, especially when authority got involved. And still they stayed calm. Because they had learned, painfully, carefully, that composure could be the difference between safety and something far worse. We'll go inside, one parent said quietly, turning to the kids. Come on. But even that wasn't enough for him. No, he said, stepping forward again. You don't get to walk away from this. At that moment, something shifted, not just for the family but for everyone who would later hear about this case. Because this wasn't a private argument anymore. It wasn't even about noise or grilling or rules. It was about exclusion. About humiliation. About a man deciding out loud that another family's existence offended him. And the children had heard every word. That was the line that could never be erased. The moment that transformed this from a neighbor dispute into something far more serious. Something that would follow all of them, from that backyard to a police report and eventually, to a courtroom where every word would be replayed with nowhere left to hide. The police arrived the way they always do in situations like this. Calm, routine, already assuming they knew what they were walking into. A weekend afternoon. A residential street. A reported noise complaint. Nothing urgent. Nothing dangerous. Just another neighbor dispute that would likely end with a warning, a suggestion to keep things down, and everyone going back inside. That assumption lasted less than a minute. The officers stepped out of their vehicle and immediately saw what didn't match the call. There was no chaos. No shouting. No disorder. The family stood together near their home, the children close to their parents, quiet and visibly shaken but composed. The grill sat unattended now, the food forgotten. No music. No crowd. No signs of the disturbance they had been told to expect. The neighbor, on the other hand, approached fast, too fast. His voice rose before the officers could even ask a question. "Finally," he said, gesturing sharply toward the family, "these people are causing problems again." The word "again" hung in the air, unsupported by any visible evidence. One officer raised a hand gently, a signal to slow down. "Sir, we'll speak to everyone," he said evenly. "Let's take this one at a time." That was the first moment the power dynamic began to shift. As the officer spoke with the family, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The parents answered questions calmly. Their voices were steady, measured. They explained what had happened without embellishment, without accusation. One of them gestured subtly toward the children, explaining that the confrontation had taken place in front of them. That detail mattered. Around them, doors cracked open. Neighbors stood at a distance, pretending to check mail or water plants, but clearly watching. A few had heard the shouting. A few had heard more than that. And then, quietly, one of them stepped forward. "There's video," the neighbor said. Not the accused neighbor, the witness. One of the officers turned. "Video?" he asked. The witness nodded and held up a phone. "I was outside when it started. I recorded it." The neighbor's posture changed instantly. Just slightly. A tightening of the jaw. A flicker of irritation. But he didn't retreat. "Good," he said. "Play it." Confidence. Pure, unfiltered confidence. The kind that comes from someone who believes authority will always side with them. The video began to play. At first, it showed exactly what the call had suggested. A family outside, cooking, children nearby. Calm. Ordinary. Then the neighbor's voice entered the frame, sharp, unmistakable. Loud enough that the microphone caught every word clearly. The officers listened. They heard the complaint. They heard the dismissal. And then they heard the comment. Unedited. Unfiltered. Spoken with clarity and conviction. A direct reference to skin color. A statement about belonging. A declaration of ownership over the neighborhood that left no room for interpretation. No one spoke while the video played. When it ended, the silence felt different from before. Heavier. Charged. The officer holding the phone didn't react immediately. He didn't sigh. Didn't frown dramatically. He simply handed the phone back and turned slowly toward the neighbor. "Is that accurate?" he asked. "Did you say those words?" The neighbor didn't deny it. "I was expressing my frustration," he said. "People need to know their place." That was the moment everything tipped. The officer's tone changed, not aggressive but firm. Professional. Controlled. "Sir," he said, "that language is not acceptable. And making statements like that, especially in front of children, constitutes harassment." The neighbor scoffed. "So now I'm the bad guy?" The officer didn't take the bait. "Right now," he said, "I'm investigating a complaint. And based on what I'm seeing, the situation isn't what we were told." He turned back to the family. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said plainly. "You were within your rights. You weren't being loud. You weren't violating any ordinance." One of the parents exhaled for the first time since the officers arrived. The neighbor's voice rose again. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I called you." "And we responded," the officer replied. "But calling the police doesn't give you the right to harass people." The officer began writing. Not a warning for noise. Not a suggestion to keep things down. A report. Against the neighbor. The reason was documented clearly: verbal harassment, discriminatory language, and misuse of emergency services. The neighbor paced, muttering under his breath, his earlier confidence draining with each line written. The officers spoke with the witnesses next. Multiple accounts. Consistent details. No contradictions. Each one reinforced what the video had already shown. When the officers finally turned back to the family, their message was unambiguous. "You're free to go inside," one officer said. "If this continues, you should document everything and contact us. You have the right to feel safe in your own home." The kids clung a little closer to their parents as they nodded. The neighbor stood alone now, arms crossed, face flushed. Not with anger this time, but with something closer to disbelief. For the first time, authority hadn't moved the way he expected it to. The script he relied on had failed him. As the police left, the street slowly returned to quiet. But nothing felt the same. The family knew this wasn't over. The neighbor knew something had shifted, and not in his favor. This was the moment most people realize why documenting truth matters. Why accountability changes when facts are recorded instead of argued. And why viewers who care about accountability usually tap subscribe right here, because stories like this don't end at the curb. They follow the truth all the way to court. The atmosphere inside Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom was markedly different from the street where this all began. Here, voices didn't carry unless permitted. Assumptions didn't matter. Only facts did. The neighbor walked in with a posture that suggested he still believed this room would validate him. His shoulders were squared, his expression tight with restrained irritation, as if he were inconvenienced by the entire process. He glanced around the courtroom with a faint smirk, confident that this, too, would end the way he expected. Across the aisle, the family sat together. The parents were composed but visibly tense, hands folded tightly in their laps. Their children weren't present, but their absence felt loud. Every word spoken in this room would be spoken with them in mind. The family didn't interrupt, didn't whisper, didn't look around for sympathy. They sat respectfully, eyes forward, waiting. When the case was called, the neighbor spoke first. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, voice controlled but dismissive, as if he were explaining something obvious to people who simply didn't understand. "This has been blown out of proportion," he said. "I was joking. People are too sensitive these days. You can't say anything without someone getting offended." Judge Caprio listened without interruption. He didn't lean forward. He didn't frown. He didn't react at all. He simply watched, hands folded, eyes steady. The kind of calm that doesn't invite debate, it waits for truth. The neighbor continued, growing bolder as silence stretched on. "I never threatened anyone," he said. "I was expressing concern about my neighborhood. That's my right." Judge Caprio nodded once, slowly. Then he turned to the clerk. "Let's review the evidence," he said. The courtroom shifted. The video was played. The same footage the police had seen, now amplified by the weight of a courtroom. The audio was clear. There was no distortion. No ambiguity. Every word landed with precision. The neighbor's voice echoed through the room, firm, deliberate, unmistakable. References to skin color. Statements about belonging. Words spoken not in anger alone but with intent. No one moved as the recording played. When it ended, Judge Caprio didn't speak immediately. He let the silence do its work. The neighbor shifted in place. The confidence that had followed him into the room began to fracture. "This was a joke?" the judge asked quietly. The neighbor hesitated. "I didn't mean it the way it sounds." Judge Caprio leaned forward just slightly. Not aggressively. Intentionally. "The law doesn't evaluate intent in a vacuum," he said. "It evaluates impact. And the impact here is clear." He turned toward the family. "You were in your own yard," he said. "Engaged in lawful activity. Your children were present." Then back to the neighbor. "And you chose to direct language at them that questioned their right to exist in that space." The judge's voice remained calm, but each word carried weight. "This isn't about free speech," he continued. "Free speech protects opinions. It does not protect harassment. It does not protect intimidation. And it does not protect discriminatory conduct directed at a family in front of their children." The neighbor attempted to interject. Judge Caprio raised a hand, not sharply but decisively. "I'm not finished," he said. The courtroom stilled again. "When adults speak this way in front of children," the judge said, "the harm doesn't end when the words stop. It stays. It teaches. It wounds. And the law recognizes that." He paused, letting the point settle. "This court doesn't excuse hate, it corrects it." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and final. Judge Caprio straightened the papers in front of him and began to deliver the ruling, not theatrically but methodically. The neighbor was found responsible for verbal harassment and discriminatory conduct. A fine was imposed, substantial enough to sting but not symbolic. Mandatory anti-bias education was ordered, not as a suggestion, but as a requirement monitored by the court. Community service was assigned, specifically in a setting designed to expose him to the diversity he had openly rejected. Then came the condition that changed his expression entirely. A restraining order. "You are to have no contact with this family," Judge Caprio said. "No verbal, no written, no indirect communication. You will not approach them. You will not comment about them. You will not involve authorities unless there is a legitimate emergency. The neighbor nodded stiffly. And let me be very clear, the judge added, his tone firm for the first time. Any violation of this order, any repeat behavior, will result in immediate jail time. There will be no warnings. The gavel came down softly. The family remained seated, absorbing the moment. Not triumphant. Not emotional. Just relieved. Protected. The neighbor stood silently now, the performance gone. The courtroom had done what it was designed to do, not amplify anger, not reward entitlement, but impose accountability. Justice didn't raise its voice that day. It spoke calmly, clearly, and left no room for misunderstanding. The ruling didn't stay inside the courtroom for long. Within hours, clips of the hearing began circulating online. First in small posts, then across platforms where people recognized something familiar in what they were watching. It wasn't just about one neighbor or one family. It was about a moment many Americans had either lived through, witnessed, or quietly feared. The clarity of the evidence, the calm authority of the court, and the unmistakable message of accountability struck a nerve. Comments poured in. People from different states, different backgrounds, different neighborhoods all saying versions of the same thing. This could have been us. Some shared stories of similar confrontations that never made it to court. Others talked about times they stayed silent, wishing someone had stepped in the way the law did here. What made this case resonate wasn't outrage alone, it was resolution. A clear beginning, a clear wrong, and a clear response. In the neighborhood where it all started, something shifted. Neighbors who had once kept their distance began checking in. Simple gestures at first, a wave that lingered, a conversation started without hesitation. Parents stopped by to tell the family they were glad they stayed. That they were sorry they hadn't spoken up sooner. That what happened wasn't acceptable, no matter how quiet the street looked from the outside. For the family, the attention was overwhelming at first. They had never wanted to be at the center of anything. All they had wanted was peace. Safety. The ability to exist without explanation. But when they did speak, they spoke carefully, not with anger but with intention. They talked about dignity. About how standing in that courtroom wasn't about winning, but about being seen. About how hearing the law acknowledge harm mattered just as much as the punishment itself. They spoke about their children, about explaining to them that what happened wasn't their fault, and that the world, imperfect as it is, still has systems designed to protect them. We didn't want revenge, one of the parents said. We wanted accountability. And we wanted our kids to see that hate doesn't get the last word. That message carried far beyond their street. Because this case wasn't about silencing anyone. It wasn't about policing thoughts or opinions. It was about drawing a line where harm begins. About reminding people that neighborhoods don't belong to the loudest voice or the longest resident. They belong to everyone who lives there lawfully, respectfully, and humanly. Across the country, viewers saw something rare. Justice delivered without spectacle. Without shouting. Without compromise. A reminder that the law, when applied fairly, doesn't need to humiliate to be effective. It simply needs to stand firm. And that firmness matters. In neighborhoods where silence has too often been mistaken for peace. In communities where fear has been normalized as caution. In moments where dignity has been treated as negotiable. The takeaway wasn't complicated. Accountability is not optional. Belonging is not conditional. And equal dignity under the law isn't an abstract promise. It's a standard that must be enforced case by case, moment by moment. Justice doesn't raise its voice. It stands firm. If you believe fairness should be louder than hate, this is your community. Like the video, subscribe, and help these stories reach the people who need to hear them, because accountability only works when it's visible.